The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the arid wilderness. The air, dry and heavy, carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Amidst the vast, rugged terrain, a lone figure moved slowly, almost deliberately. It was a bobcat. Her fur matted, her eyes sunken, and her movements sluggish as she stumbled along the edge of the dry creek bed. But what was most troubling was that this bobcat, usually known for its agility and elusive nature, wasn't running or hiding from the sight of humans. She wasn't fighting, wasn't resisting. Instead, she sat, her tired body pressed against the dirt, eyes locked on a rescuer who had cautiously approached her with a bottle of fresh water. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Sarah, a local animal rescuer, crouched low, trying to make herself less intimidating. The bobcat's refusal to drink, even the smallest sip, was a mystery to her. Her heart sank. She had seen wild animals in distress before, hungry, thirsty, scared. But this was different. The bobcat didn't seem frightened. No, she looked defeated. "Come on," Sarah whispered, holding out the bottle in front of her. "Just take a drink. It's okay." But the bobcat didn't respond. The water remained untouched. After a few moments of hesitation, Sarah knew this was beyond what she could handle alone. The bobcat's refusal to drink wasn't normal. She needed help. She immediately called Dr. Cole, the local vet who had experience with wildlife, and explained the situation. Dr. Cole arrived swiftly, and after a brief exchange, Sarah carefully loaded the bobcat into a carrier. The moment they reached the clinic, Dr. Cole began his examination. The bobcat was quiet, barely moving. Her breathing was shallow, her fur unkempt. Dr. Cole gently checked her over, noting the dehydration, the listlessness. There was something wrong here, something deeper than simple exhaustion. Then came the moment that would forever change the course of the story, the moment that would leave even the most seasoned vet speechless. Dr. Cole gently pried the bobcat's mouth open, his fingers brushing against her gums. But what he saw made him freeze. Something was lodged in the back of her mouth, a jagged, foreign object that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, Dr. Cole couldn't move. He stared at it, his mind racing. What could it be? Why was it there? The bobcat's condition suddenly made sense. The water she refused was likely too painful to drink. She was suffering in silence, unable to communicate her distress. The bobcat's body had been telling the story all along, but it took a keen eye to decipher it. The moment passed, and Dr. Cole quickly sprang into action. He knew he had to act fast. Dr. Cole stood over the examination table, his hands steady but his mind racing. The bobcat lay still, her breathing shallow, eyes clouded with exhaustion. As he prepared to remove the foreign object lodged in her mouth, Sarah stood close by, her heart aching at the sight of the animal's distress. The bobcat's body was thin, her ribs visible beneath the matted fur. She had clearly been on her own for far too long. But it wasn't just the physical toll that was apparent. There was something deeper, something in her eyes that spoke of a life lived in silent struggle. "Poor thing," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened to you?" The answer would come soon, but for now, Dr. Cole needed to act fast. He carefully held the bobcat's jaw open, inspecting the object lodged deep in her mouth. It was a shard of plastic, jagged and sharp, wedged between her teeth. He could see the irritation and swelling in her gums, the silent suffering she had been enduring. "This is bad," Dr. Cole muttered to himself. The shard had been there for a while, causing infection and preventing the bobcat from eating or drinking. The water that Sarah had offered her was too painful to swallow. It all made sense now. But the real question was, how had it gotten there? It wasn't a natural injury, nor was it the kind of thing a wild animal would typically encounter. The bobcat's wilderness was her home, and yet here she was, suffering from a human-made object lodged in her mouth. Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep anger rise within her. How many animals had suffered in silence because of careless human actions? The thought that this bobcat might have been forced into a life of pain and deprivation because of something as thoughtless as plastic filled her with rage. Dr. Cole's fingers were gentle but precise as he began the delicate task of removing the shard. He knew that one wrong move could cause more damage. As he worked, The room was filled with the soft sounds of the bobcat's shallow breathing and Sarah's quiet murmurs of encouragement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shard was removed. Dr. Cole set it aside, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The bobcat flinched slightly, but the pain was no longer unbearable. Her body relaxed, the tension in her muscles slowly starting to ease. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she stroked the bobcat's head. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first real connection between them. The bobcat's eyes, once clouded with pain, now seemed to soften, as though she recognized that help had arrived. "Good girl," Sarah whispered, her voice full of hope. Dr. Cole looked up at Sarah, his face grim but resolute. "She's not out of the woods yet. We need to get her hydrated, and we'll have to keep an eye on the infection." But there was a sense of relief in the air, a small victory in what had been a difficult battle. The bobcat was still weak, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. As Sarah gently helped the bobcat sip water, she couldn't shake the image of the shard, the object that had caused so much suffering. It was a stark reminder of how vulnerable these animals were to the dangers humans often unwittingly create. And as she looked at the bobcat's calm, trusting face, Sarah knew that this wasn't just about saving one animal. This was about something much bigger. It was about fighting for all the creatures whose lives were interrupted by human negligence, and it was about ensuring that this bobcat's suffering would not be in vain. For now, though, Sarah could only focus on the small, fragile creature before her. And with each drop of water that passed her lips, the bobcat grew stronger. Days passed, and the bobcat's condition slowly began to improve. At first, she was hesitant, still fearful of the hands that had once caused her pain. But with each passing hour, the bobcat showed signs of trust. She began to drink more water, her body slowly rehydrating, but her progress was far from certain. Sarah spent most of her days at the clinic, watching over the bobcat, comforting her, and providing food. Dr. Cole had given her antibiotics to fight the infection in the bobcat's mouth, but the road to recovery was not going to be easy. Each time Sarah tried to feed her, the bobcat would struggle, too weak to eat with any real enthusiasm. The trauma was still too fresh, the fear too deep-rooted. "She's not out of the woods yet." Dr. Cole had warned Sarah on the second day. "Her immune system is weak. If she doesn't start eating soon, we'll have to think about other options." The threat of losing her loomed over Sarah's thoughts, even as she tried to remain hopeful. Every time the bobcat turned her head away from food or water, Sarah's heart sank a little deeper. The bond they had started to form seemed fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She refused to let this beautiful creature slip away without a fight. One evening, Sarah sat beside the bobcat's cage, softly talking to her. She spoke about the wild, about freedom, about the world that awaited her once she was strong enough to return to it. "You'll be back out there soon," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with warmth. "You'll run again, climb trees, and feel the wind on your fur. You just need to get stronger, okay?" But the bobcat only blinked at her, her tired eyes reflecting a deep, quiet sadness. The bobcat seemed to understand, but she couldn't express it in words. Instead, she closed her eyes, curling up on the soft bedding in her cage, exhausted once more. That night, Sarah could barely sleep, her mind racing. What if the bobcat never recovered? What if the trauma was too much for her to overcome? Sarah's thoughts were filled with doubt, but each time she felt the weight of despair creeping in, she thought of the moment when Dr. Cole had removed a shard of plastic, when the bobcat had looked up at her, trusting her for the first time. That small moment of connection kept her going. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the clinic earlier than usual. She was determined to see a change today. She opened the bobcat's cage gently, speaking to her in a soft voice, reassuring her that she was safe. The bobcat stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, but there was no sign of the fear or resistance she had once shown. As Sarah placed a dish of food in front of her, she held her breath. The bobcat sniffed the food, hesitated, then slowly began to eat. The sight brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The bobcat was finally responding. But it wasn't just the food. The bobcat's entire demeanor had shifted. The tension in her body was lessening, and her eyes no longer seemed as clouded with fear. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time since her arrival, the Bobcat seemed ready to fight. Sarah could feel a new sense of hope blooming inside her. She hadn't lost her yet, and with each small victory, the Bobcat was getting closer to the day when she would be free again. But there were still obstacles to overcome. The Bobcat's body was weak, and the infection had taken its toll. She wasn't out of the woods yet. The next few days would be critical. Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The next few days were filled with a sense of quiet urgency. The Bobcat had shown signs of improvement, but there was still a lingering sense of fragility in the air. Sarah kept her vigil at the clinic, refusing to leave the Bobcat's side for more than a few hours at a time. Dr. Cole had been monitoring her closely, administering fluids, and continuing the antibiotics. The Bobcat's appetite was slowly returning, though she remained hesitant to fully trust the food Sarah offered. Still, each meal was a victory, a sign that the strength was beginning to return to her limbs, the energy to her body. It was a bittersweet journey, one filled with moments of hope and fear, but Sarah refused to let doubt cloud her determination. The Bobcat had come so far, and Sarah had come to understand just how deeply the connection between them had grown. It wasn't just the physical recovery that mattered. It was the trust, the bond, the understanding that no matter how far this Bobcat had fallen, she was not alone anymore. One morning, Sarah arrived at the clinic to find Dr. Cole already there, his face unusually serious. The Bobcat had been restless throughout the night, tossing and turning in her cage. But as Sarah stepped inside, she noticed a change. The Bobcat was standing now, her posture more alert. Her eyes, though still weary, no longer held the deep sadness they once did. "Sarah, we need to talk," Dr. Cole said softly as he watched the Bobcat pace back and forth in her cage. "I think she's ready." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Ready? Ready for what? The question hung in the air unanswered as the Bobcat stopped pacing and turned her eyes toward Sarah, as if understanding the moment had come. Dr. Cole explained that the Bobcat's strength was returning rapidly, but there was one more test she had to pass. The moment when she could be released back into the wild. They couldn't keep her in the clinic forever, and the longer she stayed confined, the more likely she was to lose her instincts, her desire for freedom. The Bobcat needed to be free again. For a moment, the weight of the decision seemed almost unbearable. It had been a long journey, one full of pain, recovery, and emotional connection. Could Sarah really let go of this creature she had saved? The Bobcat had come to trust her, to rely on her. The thought of releasing her into the wild felt like the hardest thing to do. But then, the Bobcat turned, walking slowly toward the door of her cage. She paused at the threshold, as if waiting for permission, for the final sign that she was ready to take the step into freedom. It was in that moment that Sarah realized something. The Bobcat wasn't asking to stay. She wasn't asking for help anymore. She was asking for her freedom, her home. The door opened slowly, and the Bobcat stepped out, cautiously at first. But with each step, she grew more confident, her paws sure on the earth beneath her. It wasn't just the physical strength that had returned to her. It was a wild spirit inside her that had always been there, waiting for the chance to break free. Sarah watched as the Bobcat moved into the yard outside the clinic, her tail swishing with purpose. She stopped, glanced back at Sarah, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. It was a look of understanding, of gratitude, of release. And then, without another hesitation, the Bobcat bolted into the nearby woods, disappearing into the wilderness. She was free. Sarah stood there for a long time, her heart full. She had given the Bobcat a second chance at life, and in doing so, had reminded herself of the power of hope, of connection, and of the resilience that exists within all creatures, even when they're on the brink of despair. It wasn't just a victory for the Bobcat. It was a victory for every animal that had been saved, for every person who had fought for their survival. It was a reminder that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever in vain. The Bobcat's disappearance into the wilderness marked the end of one journey, but it also marked the beginning of something much larger. For Sarah, it was a moment of quiet triumph, but it was also a reminder of the delicate balance between humans and the wildlife that shares this planet with us. The Bobcat's recovery, her return to the wild, was a victory not just for one animal, but for all the creatures that face silent battles every day, battles against the very people who often unknowingly put them in harm's way. As Sarah stood alone in the yard, her eyes following the bobcat as she disappeared into the trees, a thought lingered in her mind. How many more animals were out there, suffering in silence? How many more creatures were being impacted by human carelessness? Plastic waste, discarded trash, and the encroachment of urban areas into natural habitats. It was a reality that far too many animals had to live with. The bobcat story was a stark reminder that while humans have the ability to protect, we also have the ability to harm. It wasn't just a shard of plastic in the bobcat's mouth that caused pain. It was a world that humans had created. The world that, while offering conveniences for us, was often a landmine for wildlife. And yet, in the midst of that, there is hope. The bobcat had been saved because of one person who cared, who saw her suffering and refused to turn away. It was that same act of compassion, of intervention, that had given her a second chance at life. And now, Sarah was determined to ensure that others understood the power of compassion, that they recognized the need to protect the animals with whom we share the earth. The moral of the story was clear. Even the smallest act of kindness can change the world. Every person has the power to make a difference, whether it's through supporting wildlife conservation, reducing waste, or simply becoming more aware of the impact human actions have on the world around us. But the call to action didn't stop there. Sarah knew that the path to true change required more than just awareness. It required action, and she couldn't do it alone. She decided to start a local campaign to raise awareness about wildlife conservation, focusing on the dangers of plastic pollution and its devastating effects on animal life. She reached out to local schools, animal shelters, and conservation groups, encouraging others to get involved, to make small changes in their daily lives that would help protect the natural world. The bobcat story, her journey of survival, will be the driving force behind it all. Sarah knew that the work ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that every small effort counted. As she looked out over the woods where the bobcat had disappeared, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bobcat's freedom wasn't just a victory. It was a victory for all the animals whose lives were impacted by the choices humans made. And Sarah was ready to fight for them. It was time for change. It was time for all of us to take action. As the days passed, Sarah's campaign gained remarkable traction. At first, it had been a small personal project, just an effort to raise awareness about the bobcat's recovery and the importance of protecting wildlife from human negligence. But with time, word spread, and more people began to take notice. She spoke at local schools, shared the bobcat story at animal shelters, and even presented at city government meetings. Her message was simple yet powerful. The environment and wildlife could no longer be treated as an afterthought. Each time she spoke, Sarah saw a spark in her audience's eyes, a recognition that what had happened to Bobcat was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of human-caused harm to wildlife. People began to understand that animals like the bobcat didn't have a voice. They couldn't plead for help or ask for safety. It was up to humans to ensure they were protected. As the campaign grew, Sarah's message began to touch people on a personal level. She shared stories of local wildlife impacted by pollution and habitat loss, the bobcat story woven in as a powerful, tangible example. She spoke not only of wildlife conservation, but also about the responsibility each person carried. It was no longer enough to simply acknowledge the problem. Action was required. Small acts of kindness, changes in behavior, and a collective push for change. The bobcat's journey had sparked a larger movement, one that transcended her recovery. Sarah realized the power of a single story, how it could ripple out and inspire others. She was invited to speak at community events and on local news programs. People were genuinely moved by the bobcat's resilience, her quiet suffering, and her eventual release back into the wild. The bobcat had become a symbol of hope, a beacon that showed the strength of nature and the power of compassion. But even as Sarah's campaign gained momentum, her heart remained deeply connected to the bobcat. She never saw her again after that fateful day when she was released back into the wild. But that didn't matter. The bobcat had found her freedom. Sarah had given her that chance, and that was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. It was everything. Sarah knew that the freedom the bobcat had found wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. The bobcat had fought not just for survival, but for her right to return to wild, to her natural home. In some ways, the bobcat's fight mirrored Sarah's own journey. She had fought for the bobcat's freedom, but in doing so, she had learned what true freedom meant for herself. It wasn't just about saving one animal. It was about restoring the balance between humans and the natural world, about realizing that every small act of kindness, every step toward conservation, contributed to a larger cause. The realization was profound. Sarah knew that she couldn't save every animal that needed help. She couldn't undo all the harm caused by human actions, but she could do her part. And that, Sarah believed, was what truly mattered. One crisp autumn morning, as Sarah stood on the edge of the woods where the bobcat had disappeared, a sense of peace washed over her. She had seen the bobcat's transformation firsthand, from a frail, injured creature, fearful of humans, to a strong and free animal who ran toward the future. Sarah stood there, watching the trees sway in the gentle breeze, her heart full of gratitude. She thought back to the early days of the bobcat's recovery, the fear, the uncertainty, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had gripped her. But now, standing there with the wind in her hair and the sound of birds overhead, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The bobcat was free, and Sarah, too, had found her freedom. It was freedom from the doubts that had once held her back, freedom from the fear of failure, freedom from the thought that one person could never make a difference. In that moment, Sarah understood that the smallest of efforts could lead to the greatest of changes. It wasn't about the magnitude of the action, but the intention behind it. She had acted with compassion, with hope, and that had been enough to change the course of this bobcat's life. The world was full of wild animals, creatures whose lives were often overshadowed by human actions. Habitat loss, pollution, and the encroachment of urban areas into wild territories had made survival more challenging than ever. Yet, in the face of these challenges, there was hope. If people could start making small changes in their daily lives, reducing plastic waste, supporting wildlife conservation efforts, or simply becoming more conscious of the impact their actions had on the environment, then the future could be brighter for all creatures. Sarah knew that she couldn't do this alone. The work ahead was daunting, but it wasn't impossible. It required a collective effort of communities, organizations, and individuals to come together and make a real difference. She had seen firsthand the power of a single act of kindness. The bobcat's recovery was proof that even the smallest intervention could lead to profound change. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she thought of the people who had been moved by the bobcat story. She had reached out to local schools, encouraging children to be more mindful of their environmental impact. She worked with local shelters, teaching the importance of wildlife conservation. The bobcat story had become the driving force behind a movement that was gaining momentum, and Sarah was determined to keep pushing forward. As she looked out over the woods, where the bobcat had disappeared, she smiled. The bobcat was free, and Sarah had found her own sense of purpose. Together, they had sparked a movement, and it was just the beginning. The world would change, one small act of compassion at a time.